What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus was only part of the story? What if there were missing chapters in the Bible, kept hidden for centuries, revealing untold details of his life? Imagine an ancient manuscript, preserved high in the mountains of Ethiopia, holding secrets about the life of Jesus, secrets that could change everything we know about his formative years. These chapters, telling the story of Jesus between the ages of 12 and 30, are curiously absent from our traditional biblical texts. But why were these stories left out? And what is it that someone didn't want us to see? For those of us who grew up with the Bible, the narrative feels familiar. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, visited by wise men, and then, as a baby, flees to Egypt. Time fast forwards, and suddenly we see a 12-year-old Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem, astounding teachers with his wisdom. This account is found in the Gospel of Luke, in vivid detail. But then something strange happens, the narrative falls silent. We are left with a void. After this brief glimpse of his youth, the next time Jesus appears, he is around 30 years old, beginning his ministry with a baptism by John the Baptist. An entire 18-year gap, his childhood and young adulthood, remains entirely unexplained in the Bible. What happened during those years? Where did Jesus go? What did he learn? Who did he meet? These are the questions that remain unanswered, yet they are crucial to understanding the journey that shaped the man who would become the central figure of Christianity. Scholars have long speculated about what Jesus might have done in those missing years. Some suggest he traveled to India, while others believe he spent time with the Essenes, a Jewish sect known for their ascetic lifestyle. But what if the answers to these questions were not lost to time? What if they were written down centuries ago, preserved in one of the world's oldest Christian traditions? The truth is, these stories have been hiding in plain sight. They were preserved in Ethiopia, one of the world's oldest Christian nations, where the ancient Bible known as the Gaia's Bible contains 81 books, 15 more than most Western Christian Bibles. This ancient text doesn't just add extra books, it includes the missing stories of Jesus' life, detailing his childhood and youth during those absent years, stories that were deliberately left out of the Western biblical canons. Ethiopia's deep connection to Christianity is not only fascinating but unique. Christianity didn't come to Ethiopia through European missionaries. According to Ethiopian tradition, Christianity arrived there in the 1st century, brought by the Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in the Book of Acts. This makes Ethiopia one of the earliest Christian nations, potentially outside of the Middle East. But Ethiopia's story doesn't stop there. It is the only African country that successfully resisted European colonization, maintaining its independence while others were overtaken. This unique history of independence allowed Ethiopia to preserve its religious traditions, untouched by the outside forces that influenced other Christian nations. The Gaia's Bible, bound in ancient leather and written in Guizi, an ancient liturgical language, is likely the most authentic surviving version of early Christian texts. Unlike the filtered, edited Bibles we are familiar with today, Ethiopia's sacred scriptures have not been influenced by centuries of political and theological decisions that shaped the modern Christian canon. But how reliable is the Ethiopian biblical tradition? Is it just an obscure sect with questionable texts? Far from it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, was established in the 4th century, predating many European Christian bodies. While Europe was still largely pagan, Ethiopia declared Christianity its state religion in 330 AD under King Ezana. Ethiopia's connection to biblical history runs deep, with even the Queen of Sheba's visit to King Solomon mentioned in the Bible. But there's more. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Queen of Sheba and Solomon had a son, Menelik, who became Ethiopia's first emperor. This tradition is not mere folklore. In 2012, geneticists from the University of Cambridge found evidence of significant genetic mixing between Ethiopian natives and Middle Eastern populations around the time of Solomon's reign. The Ethiopian royal family, which traces its lineage directly back to Menelik I and Solomon, claims to have the original Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest containing the Ten Commandments. According to Ethiopian tradition, Menelik took the Ark back to Ethiopia after visiting Solomon in Jerusalem, and it is said to be kept in a sanctuary in the city of Aksum, guarded by a single monk who never leaves the compound. To truly understand why certain books were included or excluded from the Bible, we must first grasp how the Bible as we know it today came to be. In the early centuries after Jesus, numerous writings about his life circulated, some written by his disciples, others by witnesses, and many blending fact with legend. The first significant effort to standardize these texts came at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, convened by Emperor Constantine. However, contrary to popular belief, the council didn't finalize the biblical canon. It merely began the process of determining which texts would be considered authoritative. Subsequent councils and church fathers, including Athanasius of Alexandria, continued this work, eventually defining the 27 books of the New Testament we recognize today. The King James Bible, published in 1611, further cemented the canon for English-speaking Christians. But this translation was not just about religious doctrine, it was about unifying England under a single religious text that supported the authority of both the monarchy and the Church of England. The translators worked with texts that had already been filtered through centuries of political and theological decisions. Meanwhile, in Ethiopia, isolated by geography and politics, Christians maintained a different collection of texts, preserving books that the Western Church had discarded or forgotten. So, what do these Ethiopian texts reveal about Jesus' missing years? They offer a compelling, if not astounding, portrait of Jesus as a child and young man. In these accounts, young Jesus wasn't just a wise teacher, he was already performing miracles. One famous story tells of Jesus, as a child, shaping clay birds, and when the Sabbath ended, he commanded the birds to come to life and fly away, astonishing everyone who witnessed it. Another story describes how Jesus helped his earthly father, Joseph, who had mistakenly cut a wooden board too short for a bed. Jesus took hold of the board and miraculously stretched it to the correct length, saving Joseph from embarrassment. These texts also tell of Jesus healing injured children, bringing dead animals back to life, and displaying extraordinary knowledge of Scripture and spiritual matters, confounding the elders and teachers of his time. Stories like these suggest that Jesus' early years were not spent in obscurity, but in a life of extraordinary, divine power and wisdom, shaping him into the figure that would change the world. So, what do these hidden chapters of Jesus' life mean for us today? Perhaps it's time to ask new questions. The answers may not be in the texts we've always known, but in those we've overlooked. What if the story of Jesus you've always known is incomplete? What if there's a whole chapter missing, a chapter that could change everything you thought you understood about him? Imagine discovering ancient stories, passed down for centuries in Ethiopia, that reveal the secrets of his early life, stories of a Jesus we never knew, performing miracles as a child, wrestling with his divine nature, and navigating the challenges of growing up. These texts, preserved in one of the oldest Christian traditions, contain tales of Jesus' youth, stories that have been hidden from the mainstream Bible for reasons both theological and political. We know the basic outline: Jesus is born in Bethlehem, visited by wise men, and then escapes to Egypt as a baby. Fast forward, and the next time we hear about him, he's 12 years old, astonishing the temple teachers with his wisdom. Then, the narrative jumps forward again, and suddenly Jesus is about 30, beginning his ministry with a baptism by John the Baptist. But what happened in between those years, those 18 years? Where's the rest of the story? This missing period of Jesus' life has been the subject of much speculation. Some believe Jesus traveled far and wide, possibly even to India. Others argue that he spent time with the Essenes, an ascetic Jewish sect. But what if the answers were already written down, carefully preserved, and hidden in plain sight? The truth is, These missing years are detailed in ancient Ethiopian manuscripts, which have been shielded from the mainstream Christian canon. Ethiopia's role in early Christianity is extraordinary. It wasn't introduced to Christianity by European missionaries. Rather, the faith came to this African nation through the Ethiopian eunuch in the Book of Acts, making Ethiopia one of the first Christian nations outside the Middle East. Not only did Ethiopia maintain its Christian faith without European influence, but it also resisted colonization for centuries, preserving its own religious practices and texts. This allowed the Ethiopian Church to keep a vast collection of writings, some of which were excluded from Western Christianity. These writings, found in the Gaia's Bible, a book containing 81 books of Scripture, contain the very stories of Jesus' youth that we've been missing from our familiar Bibles. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions, has always maintained a different set of scriptures. They preserved texts that were discarded by Western Christian authorities, including stories about a young Jesus that differ from the more conventional accounts. In the Ethiopian tradition, we find stories of a Jesus who was not only wise beyond his years but also performed miraculous feats as a child. One of the most famous stories tells of Jesus shaping clay birds, and when the Sabbath ended, commanding them to fly, right before the astonished eyes of those watching. Another story recounts how Jesus helped his father, Joseph, when he mistakenly cut a wooden board too short for a bed, magically stretching it to the correct length. These accounts offer a completely different perspective on Jesus, showing him as a young boy already wrestling with his divine nature. Some of these texts describe troubling moments, such as a young Jesus using his powers in anger when another boy runs into him. Jesus curses the boy, saying, "You shall not finish your journey," and the boy dies on the spot. But Jesus then revives him after his earthly father, Joseph, disciplines him. These stories paint a picture of a Jesus learning to control his divine abilities, an ordinary child learning to balance his humanity with his godliness. Not all of these stories fit with the more familiar, gentle portrayal of Jesus we find in the canonical Gospels. Some critics argue that these accounts contradict the traditional portrayal of Jesus' perfect humanity. They argue that these texts were fabricated much later. But others defend these stories as an authentic representation of Jesus' development, showing how he matured and learned to use his divine powers responsibly. It's important to understand that in Ethiopian tradition, not all these texts are considered equal. While they are preserved as part of the Church's broader tradition, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church categorizes its sacred writings into levels of authority. The most authoritative are the canonical texts, but others are respected for their instructional value, though not viewed as divinely inspired in the same way. This approach, recognizing a spectrum of sacred writings rather than a strict in or out binary, mirrors how early Christians viewed Scripture before the canonization process took shape. So why weren't these extraordinary stories of Jesus' youth included in the Bible we know today? Several reasons are often cited. For one, early church fathers were concerned that texts portraying Jesus as a child with miraculous powers undermined the emphasis on his humanity. A doctrine developed over centuries that emphasized Jesus as fully human and fully divine, not a divine being pretending to be human. The stories of Jesus performing miracles from a young age seem to challenge this balance. Additionally, some of these texts contradicted the Gospel of John, which states that Jesus' first miracle was turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana. If Jesus had already been performing miracles as a child, this claim would be problematic. Another concern was the rise of Gnosticism, a movement that emphasized secret knowledge and spiritual revelations. Texts that suggested Jesus had hidden teachings or experiences seemed to align with Gnostic ideas, which the early church sought to suppress. Furthermore, writings that couldn't be traced back to the apostles or their immediate disciples were viewed with skepticism. As Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, uniformity in belief became vital for political stability, and texts that challenged the established narrative were seen as potentially destabilizing. It's important to note that the process of canonization wasn't a grand conspiracy but a gradual, evolving process that unfolded over centuries. Different regions of the Christian world had different collections of texts, and it wasn't until later that a standard canon was formed. Ethiopia's geographical isolation allowed it to preserve texts that other regions lost or excluded. In recent years, interest in these lost texts has grown, not just among scholars but among everyday Christians seeking a fuller understanding of their faith. The discovery of ancient libraries like the Nag Hammadi in 1945 and the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s and 50s revealed many early Christian texts that were excluded from the Bible. Similarly, the Ethiopian texts, such as the Ethiopian Book of Life, are gaining more attention and being studied alongside traditional scripture in modern seminaries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, after centuries of isolation, is now more engaged with the global Christian community, sharing its traditions through digital media, scholarly exchanges, and interfaith dialogue. These ancient texts provide us with a unique glimpse into early Christian thought and practices that were lost in the West. Ultimately, the Ethiopian texts don't alter the core doctrines of Christianity about Jesus' divinity, death, and resurrection, but they fill in the gaps, adding color and nuance to the parts of his life that have been left unspoken. These stories remind us of Christianity's diverse origins and challenge us to look beyond the traditional boundaries to understand the fullness of the faith. What we thought we knew about Jesus is just one version of the story. There's so much more to discover. Are you ready to explore this lost chapter of history? What if I told you that the story of Christianity you know today is just one part of a much larger, more complex picture? What if there were entire branches of Christian tradition, hidden from the mainstream, offering unique insights into Jesus' life and the early development of the faith? Ethiopia, along with other ancient Christian communities such as the Egyptian Coptic Church, the Syrian Orthodox Church, and the Church of the East in modern Iraq and Iran, represents a form of Christianity that evolved independently of the Roman and Greek influence that shaped the Western Church. These traditions are not mere footnotes in history. They are vital pieces of a much broader and more diverse tapestry of early Christian thought and practice. What these diverse communities remind us is that early Christianity was never a single, monolithic tradition. From the very beginning, there were multiple interpretations of Jesus' life, teachings, and divinity. The Ethiopian Christian tradition, in particular, stands as a powerful testament to how different regions and cultures preserve their own expressions of the faith, often in isolation from the dominant Christian narratives we are most familiar with today. Ethiopia's unique journey reveals how Christianity, like any living tradition, has evolved in various ways across different regions and periods. And the Ethiopian Church's survival amidst political upheavals, invasions, and modernization pressures makes its preserved scriptures all the more remarkable. For individual believers, exploring these ancient Ethiopian texts does not require abandoning the scripture most of us are familiar with. Instead, they offer fresh perspectives that can complement and deepen our understanding of the well-known biblical accounts. These texts shed light on aspects of Jesus' life that we may never have fully grasped and open up new dimensions for reflection and spiritual growth. Whether you consider these Ethiopian texts as divinely inspired scripture, valuable historical documents, or fascinating cultural artifacts, they undeniably expand our view of how early Christians perceived Jesus and how distinct Christian communities preserved their traditions about him. The story of the Ethiopian Bible goes beyond historical curiosity. It serves as a profound reminder of how knowledge and wisdom can endure against incredible odds. Ethiopia's ancient Christian tradition has weathered many storms. Its scriptures and sacred texts have survived invasions, such as the brutal assault by Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi in the 1500s, which resulted in the destruction of many churches and manuscripts. Despite suffering isolation, political turbulence, and the pressures of modernization, Ethiopia's Christian heritage has managed to survive, maintaining its spiritual identity through it all. Even in the face of destruction, these sacred traditions were not lost. In 1938, a devastating fire damaged the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, home to some of Ethiopia's most precious manuscripts. But in a miraculous act of preservation, the most sacred texts were saved, continuing a tradition of safeguarding spiritual knowledge that spans centuries. During the Italian occupation in the 1930s, and later under the communist Derg regime from 1974 to 1991, Ethiopian Christians went to extraordinary lengths to protect their sacred manuscripts. Some hid them in caves or buried them in secret containers, ensuring that these invaluable texts would not be lost to the ravages of time and political turmoil. What this unyielding persistence shows us is that wisdom that is truly worth preserving will find a way to survive, even in the most unexpected and difficult circumstances. While powerful empires and institutions have risen and fallen throughout history, the Ethiopian Christian tradition has quietly maintained its spiritual heritage, waiting for the right moment to share its treasures with the world. Now, as the world begins to open its eyes to these incredible ancient texts, we must reflect on the broader implications of this discovery. What other wisdom might be hiding in traditions we've overlooked or forgotten? What other perspectives might enrich our understanding of history, spirituality, and the human experience? These questions call us to think beyond the familiar narratives and explore the diverse roots of our faith. The Ethiopian Bible and its accounts of Jesus' missing years are just the beginning of a deeper journey into the richness of Christianity's many traditions. If you found this exploration into Ethiopia's Christian history enlightening, I encourage you to reflect on the power of preserving knowledge against the forces of time, politics, and adversity. The Ethiopian tradition is not merely a forgotten relic, it is a living link to the early centuries of Christianity, offering valuable lessons for us all. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating journeys into hidden histories and forgotten wisdom. Thank you for joining me on this incredible exploration of one of Christianity's oldest and most captivating traditions.